One day they were there and then they were gone. No explanation, no conversation, no closure, just silence. And you're left sitting with a question that have no answers. What did I do wrong? Was any of this real? How do you just disappear on someone? How do you just stop? And the silence doesn't just hurt, it unravels you because the mind cannot tolerate an open loop. It needs an ending. It needs a reason. It needs something to hold on to so it can begin to make sense of what happened. And when that ending never comes, the mind does what it always does in the absence of information. It fills in the gaps, and almost always it fills them with the worst possible scenarios. It was me, I was not enough, I was too much, I did something wrong. And that story, the one you told yourself in the silence, is almost never true. But it feels very true because it's the only explanation you had. Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to another episode with me, your host, Ani, where we never take the obvious answers seriously. Today, we are talking about something that I think deserves far more honest conversation than it usually gets, the topic of ghosting, and more specifically, why the people who disappear from your lives do what they do, what it means, and most importantly, what it doesn't mean about you. Because ghosting has become almost normalized, sadly. We talk about it casually, we joke about it, we've made it into a dating culture punchline, but underneath that joke, for the person on the receiving end, it can be one of the most destabilizing experiences a human being can go through. Not because the relationship was long, not because it was necessarily deep, but because of what disappearance without explanation does to a person's sense of reality. Most forms of loss come with an ending. A breakup, let's say, however painful, it gives you something to grieve. Words were said, decisions were made, you know what happened. But ghosting gives you nothing. And grief without an object is one of the most disorienting experiences the human mind can have, because you are not grieving a loss you can name, you're grieving a question. What happened? And that question doesn't go away. It follows you into the next relationship. It follows you into your moments of vulnerability where you consider letting someone in again and something stops you. Because the mind learned something from that silence. It learns that people can be there completely and then poof, gone without a word. It learned that connection is not safe. It learned that investments are not safe, that opening is not safe. And it files that lesson away and uses it to protect you from ever feeling that specific pain again, which is why ghosting doesn't just hurt in the moment. It changes people. It makes them smaller, more guarded, more afraid of the very thing that they want most. And that is why this conversation matters. The first thing I want to say, and I want to say it very clearly, is that ghosting is almost never about you. I know that it's hard to believe because that silence feels so personal when you're replaying every conversation looking for the moment, which moment you got wrong. But here's the truth about people who ghost. They ghost because they don't have the emotional capacity to do anything else. Not because you weren't worth an explanation, but because giving you one would require a level of emotional honesty and maturity they are not currently capable of. Think about what an honest ending requires. It requires sitting with someone else's pain. It requires taking responsibility for your own choices. It requires tolerating the discomfort of a difficult conversation without running from it. And people who ghost are people who learned somewhere along the way that disappearing is safer than staying present through difficulties. That's not a character assassination, by the way. It's a pattern, a deeply human pattern of avoidance dressed up as being indifferent, hence ghosting. The cruelty of ghosting is real, but the intention behind it is almost never cruelty. It is fear of conflict, fear of hurting you, fear of being seen as the villain, fear of their own feelings that they don't know how to process. And so they do the thing that fear always does. They disappear and leave you holding all the questions they were too afraid to answer. And here's the part that I think brings the most relief when people really sit with it. What did you actually lose? Because I want to offer a reframe that is not about minimizing your pain. It's about being honest about what was actually there. When someone ghosts you, what they're showing you is who they actually are, not who you thought they were, not who they presented themselves as, not the version of themselves you were building a future around, but who they actually are. Someone who disappears when things get real. And here's the uncomfortable question underneath that. Were you in love with the person, or were you in love with the potential of that person? The version of them you saw on the good days, the version of them you believed they could become, the version of you were already building in your mind before they had fully shown you who they were. And because connection moves fast, attachment forms quickly, and the mind, beautiful pattern-seeking, story-building mind, fills in the blanks with that person long before they've actually shown you everything. So sometimes what we're grieving isn't who they were, it's who we thought they were. Those are two completely different losses. One is the loss of a real person, and the other one is the loss of a story we were already writing that they were never fully in. I want to offer you a framework here. Not a spiritual one, not a everything happens for a reason bypass, just a logical one. People come into our lives at specific points for a specific reason, not because the universe planned it, but because of who we are at that moment, what we're ready for, what we're working through, what we need to learn, what we're vibrating at emotionally, what kind of connection we're available for. And the people we attract in these moments are people who match that specific version of us. Sometimes that match is deep and lasting, and sometimes it was always going to be temporary. Not because something went wrong, but because what brought you together was specific to a season. And seasons end. The person who finds you when you're lost is not always the person that's meant to walk with you once you're found. The person who meets you in your pain is not always the person built for your joy. And sometimes the connection, as real as it feels, was always going to have a natural endpoint. The tragedy isn't that it ended. The tragedy is that ending came without words, without the respect of a conversation, without the acknowledgement that what you shared was real, even if it was temporary. And that is the real wound of ghosting. Not the loss of the person, but the loss of the closure you deserved and you were never given. And here's the last thing that I want to offer you, and this one I want you to really sit with it. When someone leaves your life, especially without explanation, there's a version of that story where you spent months trying to figure out what you could have done differently, what you could have said, what you should have not said, how you could have been different to make them stay. But here's what that version of the story assumes: that if you had done something differently, they would still be here. And I want to gently challenge that, because people who are capable of ghosting are people who were always going to ghost. Not necessarily you, not necessarily now, but at some point when the discomfort got real enough, that is what they do. It's not a decision they made about you specifically. It's a pattern that they carry, and that pattern was always going to show up. The divergence was always coming. Maybe not today, maybe not over this, but eventually the version of them that disappears when things get hard was always going to appear. And here's the strange relief in that. You didn't cause this. You couldn't have prevented it because this was never really about you. It was about them and the unfinished work they're still carrying that has nothing to do with your worth, your value, or what you deserve. Ghosting is one of the loneliest experiences a person can have because you grieve something nobody else can fully see. There is no funeral for a person who is still alive, no ritual for a relationship that ended without ending, no socially recognized space to fall apart over someone who simply stopped responding. And yet the pain is completely real. The confusion is real. The self-doubt it creates is real. The way it makes you smaller and more guarded is real. So I want to say this clearly. What happened to you was not okay, and you deserved an explanation. You deserved the respect of a conversation. You deserved an ending that honored what you shared. However long, however deep, and the fact that you didn't get that is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their capacity. The closure you're looking for was never going to come from there because people who ghost don't have access to that kind of honesty that closure requires. The closure has to come from you, from deciding not that it didn't hurt, not that it didn't matter, but that you understand enough now to stop making their limitation mean something about your value. You were not too much, you were not too little, you were simply in the wrong timeline for someone who was never going to be brave enough to stay in yours. The right people, the ones built for where you're going, they don't disappear, they stay, even when it's hard, especially when it gets hard. And that is a person worth waiting for. So, my lovelies, thank you for being here for this. And I know this episode will find the person who needs it most. If it did, share it with someone who is still sitting in that silence, because sometimes the most healing thing is just knowing that someone finally said it out loud. And until next time, stay bold, stay aware, stay fierce, and always go beyond the mind.